Dogman Declassified, the latest book from W.J. Brendel, Ph.D. Real reports. Consistent patterns, no clear answers. Take a closer look at the evidence. Available now.
Welcome to Forever Paranormal, where shadows remember and silence has a way of speaking. I'm Dr. Bill, your guide through the strange and the unexplainable.
And I'm Deb. Every week we dig into what hides between belief and proof. Cryptids, hauntings, witchcraft, UFO sightings, and the stories people swear are true.
We don't tell you what to believe. We just look at what's possible, what's been witnessed, and what refuses to stay quiet.
If you like what we do, follow, rate, and share the show. It helps keep the lights on.
And if you want to go deeper, step inside the crypt. Patreon members get the show ad-free, a full day early, and gain access to our entire archives, years of investigations, bonus episodes, and conversations we don't release anywhere else. You can join at foreverparanormal.com or by searching Forever Paranormal The Crypt on Patreon.
And remember that you're never alone. If you ever need someone to talk to, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is 988.
People today will tell you that ancient gods came down and shaped humanity. Not as a story, not as a belief, but as something that actually happened. And if you sit with that long enough, it stops sounding like imagination and it starts feeling like a memory. Welcome back to Forever Paranormal, where we know Natinuk is more than a myth and where the veil is thin. Ghosts walk beside us, strange craft drift above us, and creatures move just out of sight. Every story is a door between worlds, and this week we step through the story of the Anunnaki and the quiet question of whether humanity has always feared it was shaped by something else. And as usual, it's time for my co-host Deb to step in and join us. Hi
Hello.
there, Deb.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Bill?
I'm doing great. You know, I do want to know something, though. What do you have for us this week?
Well, on April 26th, a claim of a 7 to 10 mile wide UFO near the sun was reported by UFO Sightings Daily based on imagery from helioviewer.org.
Mm-hmm.
This object was moving past the sun, allegedly, during solar activity. However, there does not seem to be any official confirmation or analysis of this report. And that seems like a good segue to the status of those government classified files on UFOs and UAPs. Where are they?
Well, they might be tied up with the Epstein files.
Yeah, maybe. Quote, they will be released very, very soon, unquote. So, despite all the off-the-cuff comments and dancing around the timeline from government officials, there is still no change and we are still waiting to see all the proof.
Yeah, it's kind of funny and kind of frustrating at the same time, and there's a whole lot of stuff coming into that. I know I'm not the only one that thinks some different things might be going on with this. There's some other researchers out there and stuff. But I do have to say one thing. I did see the video of the supposed 7 to 10 mile wide UFO going across the sun.
And your thoughts?
I have no conclusion because to me, it just looks like a streak in a film. It doesn't look like anything in particular.
Yeah.
So I just don't know. But Deb, one thing I do know. Sometimes the world itself feels pretty heavy. It feels old, like it belongs to something that hasn't fully let go of us yet. The Anunnaki come out of the Sumerian mythology tied to early civilizations like the Sumer, where the first written stories about gods, creation, and human purpose begin to take form. The earliest references to what we now call the Anunnaki begin to appear around 3000 BCE in the first written records of Sumer. Not as visitors, not as outsiders, but as part of a system that already existed in the minds of the people writing them down. But when you go back to those texts and you really read them, something kind of shifts. They are not describing visitors from another world. They are not describing machines or distant planets or anything that resembles what people today often imagine. The Anunnaki were part of a system, or a structure, gods who held roles tied to order, to judgment, to the balance between chaos and control, dark and the light. They were not outsiders looking in. They were built into the world itself. It was understood at that time that they just were. And yet, the feeling doesn't go away, because even in those earliest accounts, there is a thread that runs through it. Humanity is not entirely on its own. There is always something above it, something directing it, something defining its place.
What do you know about them from the original sources?
Well, Deb, what we do know comes from tablets, right? And the fragments of stories written in cuneiform was what's the writing's called, and is preserved through time and damage and, of course, translation. And in those records, the Anunnaki are often described as powerful deities who are connected to creation narratives and the structure of our existence itself, and all existence, really. They appear in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, not as a central focus every time, but as part of a larger framework of divine authority. In those stories, they are not unified in a simple way. They are not one thing, they are a group, often associated with decisions about humanity, about fate, about the world as it unfolds. Some accounts place them in the heavens, others tie them to the underworld. That alone tells you something important. These were not just fixed ideas, they were evolving even then, and that really matters. Because when people talk about the Anunnaki today, they talk about them as if they were always one clear thing, a single narrative, a single purpose. But the original material doesn't support that. It's layered, it's inconsistent at times, and it's human in the way it tries to explain something larger than itself.
So, where does the idea come from that they created us?
Well, Deb, that's where the shift happens, and it turns as clear as mud here. In the original Mesopotamian text, there are creation stories. In some of them, humans are formed from clay, sometimes mixed with divine essence, created to serve a function. Often that function is labor, right? And maintaining order, serving the gods. That part is real as far as the texts go. But what those stories don't do is describe a technological process. They don't describe genetic manipulation or engineered evolution. That interpretation comes much later. Modern interpretations or reinterpretations took fragments of these stories and began reading them through a completely different lens, a technological lens, a spacefaring lens. And once that shift happens, the entire narrative changes. I mean, the gods were no longer symbolic or mythological. They became physical, external, separate from humanity in a way that feels more literal than philosophical. And that's where things, well, they start to feel different. Because now you're just not dealing with ancient belief, you're dealing with the possibility, at least in some minds, that those beliefs were misinterpreted descriptions of something real.
Why do you think that idea sticks so strongly with people?
Well, I think it's because it answers something uncomfortable with people. If humanity was shaped by something else, then we are not entirely in control of our origin, right? Which we know, but we are not the starting point. We are the result of something. And that idea, whether people admit it or not, carries a bunch of weight. There's a difference between being created in a symbolic sense and being shaped by something with intent. One is belief, the other kind of feels like design. And even if there's no evidence to support the second idea in the way people often present it, the emotional pull of it just doesn't disappear, it lingers. Because those ancient stories, even in their original form, already contain a version that was not comfortable. It was discomfort, right? Humans made with purpose. Humans placed into a system. humans existing within a structure they did not create. I don't think that part needed reinterpretation. That part was already there. And when modern perspectives started layering new ideas onto those old texts, well, they didn't create something entirely new. They amplified something that was already present. A quiet question. Not just where do we come from, but who decided? That's where the unease begins. And once it starts, well, it really doesn't stop. That question didn't come out of nowhere. It builds slowly, almost quietly, out of what's already there. Because once you move past the surface of these early records tied to Sumer, you start to see something else forming underneath. Not a clean story, not a single narrative, more like a pattern that keeps repeating in slightly different ways. The pattern is creation is never simple. In some of those accounts, humanity is brought into existence to take on work of the gods, right? The gods no longer want to do that, so they make us. That's not interpretation. That's written directly into the structure of the story. Humans are formed from the earth, sometimes mixed with something divine, and placed in a role that already exists. But there's no moment where humans choose that role. They're just placed into it.
Are you talking about symbolic meaning here or something that people literally believe?
Well, at that time, I don't feel there was a separation between those ideas the way there is now. I mean, those stories weren't labeled as myth in the way we use that word today. They were part of how people understood reality itself, the world, the sky, the reason things existed the way they did. But even within that framework, there's a tone to those stories that doesn't feel entirely comforting. Humans are not the center, right? They are part of a system that is already in motion. And the Anunnaki, as they appear across different texts within Sumerian mythology, are tied to decisions, to authority, to the kind of control that doesn't need to explain itself. That's where the unease starts to deepen, because once you strip away the language, once you take out the names and the cultural framing, what you're left with is a very simple idea. Something created us for a purpose, and that purpose may not have been ours.
Is that where modern interpretations take over?
Well, yeah, kind of. That's where they find their footing. Because when you take the core idea and you view it through the modern lens, then, especially one shaped by technology and the possibility of life beyond Earth, it starts to look a little different. The same story begins to read like something else entirely. It doesn't read like gods, designers, not creation, but construction. I mean, they're designers. They aren't gods at that point. But that shift doesn't come from new evidence. It simply comes from new perspective. The original text haven't changed. The translations haven't suddenly revealed hidden descriptions of advanced technology. What changes the way people interpret what they're reading? And once that door opens, well, it's hard to close, because now every line can be re-examined. Every fragment can be reinterpreted. Every gap can be filled with something that feels more tangible to the modern mind.
Is there anything in the original material that supports the idea that they're aliens?
Yeah, no, not at all. Directly, no. Gotta say no. I mean, there is no clear description of extraterrestrial origin. There's no language that points to any kind of machinery. There's no language that points to travel between the worlds, to anything that would firmly place these beings outside of the mythological framework that exists within. But that doesn't mean the stories are simple. They still carry that underlying tension. Humans created to serve. Humans shaped from something else. Humans existing within a hierarchy they didn't choose. That part doesn't need modern interpretation to feel unsettling, because it already is. And maybe that's why the newer versions of the story today take hold the way they do. Not because they're supported by any kind of stronger evidence, but because they give form to something that was already sitting beneath the surface, right? A discomfort that's been there from the beginning.
You mentioned this shows up in other places. Is this unique to Mesopotamia?
No, not entirely, Deb. You can find echoes of similar ideas in other cultures, right? Stories where humanity is shaped, guided, or influenced by something beyond itself, but those parallels are not identical, and they come from some very different traditions. It's important not to flatten them out in a single narrative, like saying God created Adam from clay, where the Anunnaki created man from dirt, right? What matters here is that in this specific context, within early Mesopotamian writing, that idea is already present. Humans are not self-originating. In other words, according to this text, you can throw Darwin out the window, right? Because they are part of something larger, and once that idea exists, it doesn't stay contained. It carries forward. It gets reinterpreted like it's doing now. It adapts to whatever framework the current world is using to understand itself. And right now, that framework includes technology, space exploration, and the possibility we are not alone. So, the old stories shift again. They take on new meaning, not because they changed, but because we did. And somewhere in that shift, the question becomes harder to ignore. Not just who created us, but whether we were ever meant to ask who created us. That question isn't resolved, it just kind of sits there. And the longer you leave it alone, the heavier it gets. Because once you accept that these early accounts from Sumer were trying to explain a structured world, not just tell stories, you start to see how deliberate that structure feels. Like nothing is accidental. Everything has a place. The gods have roles. The world has order. Humanity fits somewhere inside that. But it's not at the top.
So, where do humans fit in that structure?
Below, very uncomfortably below. Not just below in power, but below in purpose. In several of these accounts, humans are created to relieve the burden of labor from the gods. Right? That's the function. Maintain what already exists. Carry the weight of the system so something above doesn't have to. There's no suggestion that humanity was created out of curiosity or care. It's practical, almost procedural. And that's where the tone shifts again, because you are not just dealing with origin here, you're dealing with intention. And intention changes how people hear a story.
That doesn't sound like creation, and it sounds more like an assignment.
Yeah, that's exactly how it reads, Deb. You're right. And when you look at how the Anunnaki are positioned within the Sumerian mythology, they are not distant or passive. They are involved in decisions about humanity. Not always directly, not always consistently, but enough that their presence carries weight. But they don't always move at one. Because there are moments in these stories where different figures in the Anunnaki world within that system respond to humanity in different ways. Authority doesn't always look the same. Control doesn't always act the same. Some decisions feel final, others feel, well, interrupted. And that tension shows up more than once. It doesn't divide cleanly into sides. It doesn't present itself as conflict in the way we might expect. But it's there. A system that doesn't always agree with itself. A structure where outcomes aren't always coming from a single source. And that's what makes it heavier. Because now we're not just dealing with something above us, you're dealing with something above you that isn't entirely consistent.
Do you think that's where fear comes from?
Yeah, I think it's part of it, Deb. I really do. Look at it this way. If you grow up inside a system where your existence is defined by something above you, something you didn't choose and can't change, well, it leaves a mark on you. Even if you accept it, even if you believe it fully, because there's always the question underneath it. What if that's not the whole story? And that question doesn't belong just to the past, it carries forward. It shows up in different forms depending on the time period, depending on the culture and the language being used to describe it. Right now, it shows up as the idea that humanity may have been shaped by something more advanced, by something external, by something intentional. But if you take away the modern framing, what you're left with isn't that different from what was already there. A sense that we were placed, not just started.
But if the original texts don't describe anything like that, why are people convinced?
Because it fills a gap, Deb. The original accounts explain the purpose, right? But they don't explain mechanism. They tell you what humans are for, but not how that process would look in a physical sense. So that leaves a space. And people tend to fill space in with whatever makes the most sense for them at their own time. So in a world shaped by technology, that space gets filled with ideas of design, of construction, of engineering. It becomes easier to imagine something tangible behind the story. But that doesn't mean the story was originally pointing to that. It means the story was open enough to allow it. And that's where interpretation takes over.
Do you believe this is just a case of people projecting modern ideas onto ancient texts?
Yeah, in many ways, that's exactly what it is, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean it's meaningless. It tells you something about the people doing the interpreting, about what they're trying to understand, about what feels unresolved. Because even if the ancient writers weren't describing extraterrestrial beings or advanced technology, they were still describing a world where humanity wasn't the source of its own existence. That part is consistent. That part is what carries forward, right? And maybe that's the reason the Anunnaki don't stay contained to the past. They move with the story. They change shape depending on who's looking at them. Not because they are changing, but because the question behind them never really goes away.
And what is that question?
Well, who or what had a hand in making us? And what are we? And just as important, why? That's where the line starts to blur for me. Because once you start asking that question, it stops being about ancient text. It stops being about Mesopotamia or mythology or reinterpretation. It becomes something closer to identity. And identity is harder to contain because it doesn't stay in the past. It follows you. It shows up in the way people search for meaning, in the way they look for patterns, in the way they try to connect themselves to something larger, even if they don't fully understand it. And sometimes that search leads back to the same place. Ancient stories, old names, the Anunnaki, not as proof, not as evidence, but it's something that still feels unfinished. All right, Deb, you've heard my take on the Anunnaki, and I know you've sat through enough ancient aliens that you've heard the various versions and others out there over the years. So what is your take on the Anunnaki?
Putting my personal beliefs aside, I find the story intriguing, as are most mythological tales. To me, it sounds like another option for people to explain their existence, and it fills the gaps for those who seek that. I think it's just human nature, and if it gives someone peace of mind, then the story's done its job.
Yeah, that's a very good way to look at it. However, I feel I need to point something out before we close, because when you step back, this pattern doesn't belong to one culture. It shows up again and again. It's in almost every religion. Different names, same structure. Humanity created by something beyond itself, placed in a role it didn't choose. Not the same stories, but close enough to feel familiar. And that familiarity might be the part that stays with you. Well, at least until next time when we discuss another tale yet to be told. Thanks for listening to Forever Paranormal. Follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others find us and keeps the stories coming. Step inside the crypt for archive and exclusive episodes at foreverparanormal.com. And keep up with my latest books and research at wjbrendel.com. And until next time, remember, the veil is always thinner than you think.
Whatever you do, From Dr. W.J. Brendel, author of Cryptids and Monsters of North Carolina, comes a haunting new true history. Heretics of the Harvest Moon, the true story of the witch trials. A tale of fear, faith, and fire that shaped centuries of persecution. Available now on Amazon and at wjbrendel.com. Step into the darkness and see who survived the flames.